Hello, everyone. Welcome to Automata. Oh, it's that kind of house. All right, here we go. I told Lizzie tonight that I would do a little intro because I wanted there to be some format to this. This could be as easy as the two of us, and will be. In a few moments, the two of us are about to have a conversation that you will probably join in later on. This is about an hour and a half ahead of you in discussing this book, which I'm about to talk about. But I want you to know that I'm introducing my niece. You know that yes, my niece, Lizzie Wade, but not yet. Not yet. I told her, you have to wait for me to sing your praises for about three minutes. And the reason I'm doing this is because I love this kind of book. This kind of book and the magazine articles Lizzie has been writing for years are, first of all, what I make a living doing, absorbing that information. So I track these great writers that the John McPhees of the world and that sort of school of writing. So it's really valuable to me when I find somebody I really like and who gets it as far as delivering information. From the day I read Lizzie's first article, she is my favorite one of those. And I'm not kidding. This is not uncle talk here tonight, by the way. Just get ready. This is a fanboy talk. It is an emotional experience for me when I read scientific information, anthropological information, archaeological information, whatever it is, that pulls me into a world that I don't understand. And I don't know why that feels that way, but I think I'm among my own here. We have all been reading Lizzie's work for so long, and that is a very rare quality in a writer, to be able to do that. And I think it's a genetic quality. And I don't mean to, if I have any of that quality, it will come out talking tonight about what I've done on television. It doesn't compare to the skill level that Lizzie has in doing this. This book is the high water mark of her career. and it's only going to get deeper from here, right? That's the right metaphor. And that's so exciting. So you guys are here at the very beginning of an incredible trajectory that we are going to watch her on as she takes this bigger step towards these thicker versions of what she does, and it's going to be so exciting. I want to say thank you to Automata. If none of you have ever been here before, if some of you have never been here before, I have had some of my great experiences in this room over the years, and I'm talking decades, because Janie Geyser and her folks, it's an artist collective, have been working in this space for a very long time, and I've seen some of the most innovative work here and on the East Coast through Janie's career, and my brother-in-law who is on the board here. So anyone who is curious about where they're sitting at, you can come back and see great stuff here, and you should check automata.org to watch for what they do. Even the website's cool. It's really fun. So tonight's talk will have a shape somewhat similar to the book, in my opinion, or my prediction. We're going to start with the introduction and kind of work through the book very generally at first, and then come down in detail on certain ones of the chapters. And if you haven't read the book, my job here is to keep you interested. So you go and buy this book and tell your friends to buy it. And if you had, there's ones right up here. Later on, we will be selling them, and Lizzie will be signing them, as usually happens at a reading like this. So, but that is the difference here. This would be typically begun with a reading. We're jumping right in. So that's why I'm being careful about introducing you to this, so that you understand that you're diving in the deep end of an incredible book that you are going to read or listen to, which I did writing down here at 3.0. I was like, she's talking in my ear so fast. But even the reading of it is fantastic. So, all right, I've said my piece. So now let me introduce Lizzie Wade to you. Welcome to the stage. Hello. Here is your audience.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for having me. Thank you to Automata and Janie and Susan and everyone for organizing it.
That didn't embarrass you, did it?
No,
that was
not
good?
at all.
Okay, good. There you go. Thank you. I'll do the same. Let's start, Lizzie, with the word, apocalypse. Mm-hmm. It's a misunderstood idea. It's a misunderstood word. So even the etymology is real. I gotta do this. I can't see you. Tell us about that, first of all. Why did you choose this title? And in general, the subject matter.
Yeah, so I chose the word apocalypse precisely because I think it's meant so many different things throughout history. You know, it's from ancient Greek. It means the unveiling or the revelation, which I think is like a beautiful piece of these experiences a lot of the time. And, you know, of course, we have it today, like zombie apocalypses, like the end, you know, full-on ends of societies, dark ages, civilizational collapse. And I liked how layered it was, because I think we need more words these days for events that aren't just one contained disaster or crisis, but are, you know, intertwined, overlapping, kind of multi-causal events. I think, you know, I probably could have titled the book The Polycrisis, but like that's, I think apocalypse is more resonant, and I think they probably should have chosen that one when they were looking for interesting words to try to get us thinking in these sort of larger, not only larger timescales, but larger effects and larger experiences and impacts on societies. So when I was looking at apocalypses in the past, you know, I wanted to write, there's been books about, you know, about societal collapse or about natural disasters, or, you know, like the eruption of Pompeii, or things like that. We all know some famous examples. But what I was looking for in both the word and the examples that I chose were crises and losses that really fundamentally changed how a society saw itself and the people's way of life within it. And so, you know, and oftentimes that goes beyond just one single natural disaster, or it goes beyond one single, episode of climate change. Like there's a lot of, in the book, about how climate change kind of intersects with the political crisis, and they kind of feed on each other in this, in a loop. And, and looking at these events, so I wanted something that felt big as the events that we can feel ourselves experiencing today, and really take that scale seriously, both for us and for the past peoples and cultures that I study. And when I was researching them, one thing that came up over and over again was like, I also didn't want to focus just on the ends of societies. And I think the most important, if you take anything away from the book, I really hope it is that apocalypses are transformations.
Exactly.
And they're not just endings.
Well, okay, when I heard you were writing this, and I heard the title, I thought, doomsday. That's the knee-jerk reaction that an American audience will generally have to the name, because it's so associated with the Book of Revelations and the religious doomsday aspect of it. But even the Book of Revelations is called Revelation because something is revealed. Really, it's Hollywood movies that have gotten us crazed about the word apocalypse. So something is transformed was your criteria about each and every one of these. The other understanding I had was that there was not going to be one apocalypse, that this was going to be a bunch of apocalypses. So you say, define again what makes you think of an apocalypse as important.
As important, yeah. So I defined the word apocalypse in my book as a rapid collective loss that fundamentally transforms a society's way of life and sense of identity. And I think there's a couple like key pieces of it, that it has to be fast, like it doesn't have to be over quickly. There's several apocalypses in the book that actually take hundreds or even thousands of years. But I wanted to think about crises in the past where during the span of a human life, someone living through it would feel a change from the beginning into the end. And they might, usually people don't live through the entire apocalyptic experience, like they do take place over a much longer time. But I wanted something that the people who were experiencing it would have known that like something was up, something was going on.
So an apocalypse is actually ending something for sure.
I think it has to, for me, it has to be a loss of something. But I think key to how I sort of changed my thinking about that going in was that I think that doesn't mean that it has to be a tragedy. And I think that like it can be a tragedy, or it is often a tragedy for certain parts of society and not for others. Those people are who have those different experiences can change over the course of an apocalypse. But yeah, I think I wanted it to feel not just like any, all societies are changing all the time. So I wanted it to feel the people who, when I tried to imagine the people's experience living through it, I wanted to be pretty sure that they would have known that they were living in exceptional times, just like we do today.
The most surprising part of this book is how upbeat it is. I'm serious. And maybe that's your skill in delivering this information, and you do it so well, as I said. But it also, there is an inherent joyful quality to the fact that all things end and then begin. And so each apocalypse in here is a different kind of apocalypse. You have climate change, you have extinction, you have all kinds. I mean, how many would you say roughly are in this book?
I think, well, there are 9 stories overall, but there's sort of the underlying causes of a lot of those apocalypses are similar. So it's like, I'd say I considered climate change, plagues, invasion, colonialism, and colonialism and slavery kind of entwined, and societal collapse, which often doesn't happen on its own, is entwined with climate change, or there's another kind of forcing event that causes the political unraveling. But yeah, I sort of wanted to think about sea level rise, which is like a climate change experience, but was a particular one at the end of the last ice age when the glaciers melted and sea level rose all over the world. That was probably the last like global apocalypse before colonialism and climate change today. So I think a lot of the the scale or can be different between these events and, between what we're experiencing today. But a lot of them had sort of underlying similar causes. But the fun part for me, and I think there is a lot of joy in the book, and I think there is a lot of creativity and opportunity in how these societies reacted. But I also think part of the fun part of the book is getting to know all of these past people, and that was certainly the fun part for me, and really exploring all these different ways that to have a society, to be human, what it means to survive, like that looks really different over places and times, and like how just trying to get into those details and into those experiences, I think that's part of what makes the book fun.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's the unlikelihood of the name becoming like, oh, this is much more than disaster we're talking about. This is actually transformation. And it's right in the terminologies of the table of contents. It has three major parts. Foundations is one, foundations. Two, transformations. Three, new worlds. And each one of those parts has three chapters within it. And each chapter is a different example of, or several examples within the chapters, of different types and definitions of an apocalypse. That's a really fun trip to go on because it's unexpected. Each one sort of reveals itself as you head to it. So let's move on to those chapters now. Everybody get a good feeling about what this book is about? Yes, we do. Good nod and thank you. The first chapter was the most surprising one of all to me. I mean, really, right out of the gate, you are challenging something that I realize I've been living, I'm 64 years old, for God's sakes. All my life, I have understood this as one thing, and in the first 2 pages of that chapter, I was like, oh my God, I didn't understand that at all. And it's the so-called extinction of the Neanderthal by the Homo sapiens. Okay, for anybody who doesn't know, a lot of this book is about archaeology. A lot of it is about anthropology. And so the old school idea that I was believing was that here was this evolved human who was living in northern Europe areas, and they were heavy, and they were grumpy, and they were big, and they had big brows, and they were kind of violent, and they were just living in caves, and this whole sort of thuggish thing is in my head. And then along comes the Homo sapien, who's elegant and, got a more refined quality. They're more evolved. And because, of course, it's like we're right in the beginning of 2001 Space Odyssey. Of course they're going to take over this other culture and probably violently do them in because they're better than them. Then I read your story. And how wrong is that?
Yeah, it's sort of shockingly wrong, or at least it could be wrong.
Thanks.
I think I think the story we all grew up learning, and Neanderthal even now is like an insult, And I think by the time I started writing about archaeology, a lot of archaeologists themselves had really started correcting their own assumptions and taking Neanderthals more seriously. And when I went back and read, so I sort of knew, I knew there was discovery of Neanderthal art. They very likely had language, like based on genetic evidence. They seem to have, coordinated and cooperated to hunt in groups. They have like extremely advanced weapons. And so, I knew that archaeologists were kind of correcting these assumptions about Neanderthals, but I didn't really understand where the original ideas had come from. And so when I went back and read some of the sort of founding documents of physical anthropology, or biological anthropology as it's increasingly being called, about the discovery of these bones in caves in Europe, I was really, really shocked at how little evidence there had been from the beginning that Neanderthals were lesser than Homo sapiens, and it was really more about they realized they were discovering a different kind of human, or a debate was whether these people were humans at all, and they understood it possibly could fit in that category. But the anthropologists of the 19th century, who were really the founders of the field, their most important project was to sort people into different kinds of categories and put those categories in a hierarchy. And most of that category was what we is race, but you know, that wasn't the only category. And so when they started seeing a different kind of human with a different kind of skeleton and a different kind of culture even, you know, they just assumed from the beginning that that difference meant inferiority, and that because those humans weren't around anymore, Homo sapiens had to have come in and wiped them all out because we were more evolved, more fit, whatever. And I was, you know, for how, you know, how much that story has become conventional wisdom, I was really, really surprised at how little evidence there ever had been of it, and from the very beginning.
Yeah.
And so, you know, and some of the most exciting research about Neanderthals today is, of course, based on ancient DNA, which is like an incredible advance in archaeological science that allows researchers to extract DNA from bones and compare those family trees to each other, to us. The level of detail is absolutely amazing, and so that, of course, revealed that we all, you know, everyone in this room very likely carries a little bit of Neanderthal ancestry in us, and that's because we
I knew it.
yes, and you know, and I thought, well, you know, that actually, you know, that is real scientific evidence that could very well point to us working together and forming communities and forming families. I mean, that is what happened. Like, that's the genetic evidence. And I thought, you know, we really, like, not only do Neanderthals deserve a better version of this story, we deserve a better version of this story that's not based on the worst things we can imagine doing to each other and other people, you know?
Well, you've chosen this particular chapter, or this subject matter for the first chapter, because it's so popularly understood to be extinction, when indeed it really isn't. So that, in this case, apocalypse is extinction, and we're already turning that on its head. You're mentioning something that really weaves its way through the whole book, which is the advent of new technology. That is really the difference. How do you say it? Schaffenhausen?
Schaffenhausen, I think
Yeah,
so.
Schaffenhausen is the German, what would you call him? He was an archaeologist in those days.
I think they're all kind of everything at that point.
Yeah.
He might have thght of himself as a geologist or zoologist.
And we're talking about 1856.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating. The first discovery of this bone, this skull, partial skull, was because they were digging so much limestone out of this particular Neander Valley in the Dussel River area of Germany. And as they were pushing the mud off of these digs, trying to get to that limestone, which had caves in it in those days, somebody saw, who was he was a kind of a history guy, right?
Yeah, there was someone from, I think someone working on the excavation was like in the Natural History Club.
Yeah, they were all kind of amateur guys in those days.
Yeah, everyone was. And so he called his friend from the Natural History Club and said, I think they first found a long bone, and I think at the beginning they thought it was probably a cave bear, because they were finding more and more. This is when, you know, around the same time as when dinosaurs were being sort of like discovered or categorized by Europeans, and so you'd find these old bones of extinct animals, and that was kind of the only unequivocal sign of antiquity, you know, if you found an extinct animal. So a long time passed by of like trying to figure out how old Neanderthals were at all.
But he had his own particular trick of figuring out if it was an old, old fossil.
Yeah, so the best way that they could figure out age in those days was to take the bone and lick it, and if it's stuck to your tongue, it was fossilized, and if it didn't stick to your tongue, it was not.
I buy it.
And that turns out to be not such a great test. It wasn't that accurate. But it did convince them that the Neanderthals were appropriately ancient, that they got really interested.
It's fascinating because in those days, this became a very big deal. I've covered this in the mid-19th century because so much media was going on and so much more travel was happening because of ships, and people's ideas were getting exchanged a lot faster in conferences and so forth. So it was no coincidence that they were discovering and linking these ideas together like never before. And then, so within your same story, you have that same thing happening with new tech. You know, it's no coincidence that we're revising these things now. So how do they make this decision based on what kind of technology that this Neanderthal has this other element to it?
The ancient DNA?
Yeah.
Today? Yeah, so basically today, they had, well, it was hard because all these 19th century scientists had licked all these bones and left their own DNA on them. And so it was this huge, multi-year effort to find bones that were, appropriately, didn't have preservative chemicals all over them, didn't have modern DNA all over them. And, I think they had only just sequenced the full Homo sapiens modern genome from blood, 10 years prior. But they would go, they had like every museum all over Europe was sending in these bones to be tested for DNA. And, it wasn't only, if the DNA showed up, you had to be 100,000% positive that it was not a modern human DNA. And it was just this huge, huge, huge project that went on for years. And I don't think anyone would have ever expected Neanderthal DNA to survive at all, and let alone reveal so many surprises.
Sure.
And actually, full other human species like the Denisovans, who are only at this point known from their DNA, but they were looking for the Neanderthal DNA. They found like a tiny little piece of a pinky bone, like I think the size of 2 grains of rice put together, one of the scientists said, and they sampled the DNA, and that turned out to be, they were expecting to find Neanderthal if they found anything at all. And it was this whole other human species that we had no idea even existed. So it wasn't really just a story of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. There were so many other kinds of humans, and probably ones we don't even know about at the time. And those extinctions are a lot more mysterious. And a lot of modern humans today also carry Denisovan DNA, so we know there were these mixing, new human communities were forming, a lot of mixing was happening, migration. This was a period of extreme climate instability, so people were really trying to be creative to survive, especially since they were very mobile hunter-gatherers who really would have known their environment very intimately, but also depended on a certain steadiness of the environment. And
Lizzie, if I can
yes.
interrupt you, I have this book that has a lot of what you're talking about in it. Could I read a little bit of it?
Sure.
So this is probably the 3rd page of that chapter, maybe something like that, about the technology involved. Okay, so you wrote this. The scientist is named Johannes Krause.
Krause.
Yeah, Krause, thank you. And he just entered into the lab. This is modern days, right?
Yes.
Yeah. On many days.
2000. Oh, okay.
Top of the page.
Top of the days. On many days when Johannes Krause reported for work at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, he had to make sure to avoid absolutely everyone. Using a special entrance that led directly to a series of rooms in the basement, Krause was forbidden from chatting with or even being in the presence of his colleagues working upstairs in different labs. He couldn't risk being contaminated, or at least any more contaminated than he already was. To that end, Krause would go straight to the basement and change his clothes. He would put on a face mask, affix paper booties over his shoes, and pull a puffy shower cap-like cover over his mop of blonde curls. He snapped on not just one, but several pairs of surgical gloves. He knew that once he was inside the lab, shedding a single hair or smudging just one surface with a fingerprint could set his whole team back years.
Yeah. So I wanted you to read that because that's how detailed the description goes into and how personal you get with this. And that's what you mentioned in the introduction, that this is a different style for you than the magazine work that you've done. I mean, I'm sure you talked very specifically about individuals, but you create characters in this story as well, right? You pull together, you synthesize information into certain characters. This is a departure for you, right?
Yeah, I think I got to go much deeper into people's processes, not just what they discovered, but what the questions were going in, the surprises they found, and how they felt about the apocalypses they were studying. I mean, a lot of the interviews happened over the course of the COVID-19 quarantine, and so talking to scientists who were studying apocalypses during one that we were all experiencing, I think it really changed it changed kind of the emotional tenor of the interviews, and it also changed how they, many times, were reflecting on the people in the past that they studied, and sort of opened up new vistas of imagination for them, and realizing, actually this piece of the experience was much more important than I imagined, like, or just saying, yeah, oh yes, and there was an epidemic in this year, and really like having the emotional experience to connect what what we were going through all together to, more deeply imagining people in the past, or what it feels like when your whole world, you go from feeling like you have a whole world at your fingertips and a whole interconnected international community, because of course many of these people are academics, to being able to see the 4 people in your apartment building,
Yeah.
and feeling and connecting that to the people they were studying in the past. And I think the real departure for me was feeling more free and confident to take those experiences and really write pieces, not only set from the scientist's perspective, but set from the perspective of people in the past, and sometimes known historical figures, sometimes more general communities, sometimes one sort of single moment in an apocalypse, sometimes more, tracing it from the beginning to the end, and taking that kind of more both. It was really interesting to be able to play with that kind of more personal register of trying to get to individual people's experience, and not just, a broad cultural trajectory, as archaeology, often studies, and those are the terms I often am writing in, but also kind of a more mythological perspective in a lot of these cases, where there's there is a distance between what, how sure we can ever be of the details, despite all the advances in technology, despite these amazing ancient DNA, which really does, or bioarchaeology, which is like gives you such incredible detail into the lived experience of a single individual in the past. But there's, of course, always going to be some distance between what we can know for sure and
The
what
problem,
we can
the
study.
challenge of apocalypse is it takes a long time
Yes.
to have some kind of perspective over this. No
Yeah.
one person in the middle of apocalypse, arguably we're in the middle of one right now, which is kind of one of the points of the book.
Yes.
And how, I mean, we have a lot at our disposal as far as information goes that other people wouldn't have had in the ancient times. Nonetheless, it's hard to know when our apocalypse started and when it will end. We don't know. So that's part of the problem that you had as far as creating the book, is how do you have a person that knows what's going on?
Yeah, and I think when I started writing the book, I thought, one of the questions I carried into the project was like, okay, I want to, what is similar about the experiences we're having today and the problems we're facing today as these past people, but also what is different, and one of the things that I thought had to be different for us was like the level of information that we have, and the feeling that we can sort of see these things coming, and we know something is happening, but it hasn't quite happened to us yet, or it hasn't quite arrived, or, because we have climate models, we have international news, we have the internet, we have like all these, like all these ways to know things at a distance, and sort of at a temporal distance too, like we can sort of, these climate models predict the future. But I actually ended up feeling like that many, if not most people in the past who experienced an apocalypse had exactly the feeling that we're having right now. Like they often would have known that something was going wrong before it actually arrived to upend their lives personally. And I thought, I thought a lot about sort of the emotional experience of starting to lose, of like climate grief, of starting to lose an ecosystem you're familiar with, in the chapter about El Nino, because one of the things archaeologists have discovered is that El Nino is a climatological phenomenon that happens. It begins off the coast of Peru, where normally the sea is cold, and around Christmas, the arrival of El Nino, the Christ child, this, like, some years, for reasons that scientists still don't know, the water becomes warm, and that like creates havoc because more water evaporates. It's one of the driest deserts in the world. Suddenly there's huge amounts of rain, flash floods, mudslides, and I think we've all, like, I vividly remember an effect of an El Nino in California in 1998, and probably a lot of us do. And so it has effects around the world, but in Peru it's very severe, and scientists discovered that 5,800 years ago, that before 5,800 years ago, El Nino didn't really happen. Like the sea was always warm, and you can see that from the kinds of shellfish people were eating. They don't live in cold water. And so they could sort of see the arrival of cold water in the past, and then they could use that to extrapolate to like, oh, this is when El Nino started happening. And I thought a lot about like, oh, what would have been the experience of the people 5,800 years ago who, literally their environment would have turned upside down, and it wasn't every year. In fact, back then it was a little bit longer of a time frame. It would happen like once or twice a century, but certainly in collective memory. And then it started, it probably happened once and people were like, oh my God, like, glad that's over, like that was crazy. And then it would happen again and again and again, and how people would have coped with that kind of dislocation, that kind of fear, and most of all, that kind of disruption of trust in your own ecosystems and the landscape that you thought you knew. And I thought that, I know many of us are feeling those feelings all the time, and I thought, they must have felt it too.
Oh my God. So this is the Peruvian chapter, probably the third one in the book. That is a geographic story as much as a climate story. It's a very, very thin strip of Western South America, Peru, obviously, but in the northern part, which is a very desert and arid area to this day. So you're describing something that happens to a group of people, a civilization who has learned to bring water down from the hills into this arid dirt. They've got a farming, agricultural society going on, and then suddenly out of nowhere, the fish are dying, like on the beaches. All kinds of bad things are happening, and they don't have the reference points of science to understand this at all. Probably they have more information than we know and give them credit for, thinking they're all innocent little people out there, but they're survivors. Nonetheless, it's extremely unsettling. And so the different communities operate differently, of course, and later on, for sure, I'll share you a story I know about, which is very extreme. What does this group do in response?
Yeah, so when El Nino first began, actually they hadn't started farming yet, so they were still like really fishing, hunting and gathering, but mostly, not terrestrial hunting and gathering, like a lot of ocean shellfish, marine fish, marine animals, seabirds. So it was like an extremely fertile landscape. And I think, but they were living, quite in small groups. Like hunter-gatherers tend to live in kind of small mobile bands and come together at certain times of year and can break apart at other times. And I think when I was thinking about, okay, what would happen, what would be the impact of a repeated natural disaster, like verging on, definitely in my conception, like if it keeps happening over and over again, like that definitely rises to the level of an apocalypse for me. And how would that have felt, and what would have inspired them to do? And I think a lot of us today would think, oh, well, if an apocalypse hits a society like ours, like the society breaks apart, and so if the society's already, or if the society doesn't quite exist yet, and they're all living in small groups in the landscape and distributed, it would seem like, impossible. The apocalypse would make it impossible for people to come together into something larger and more cooperative, and everyone would sort of be defending their territory and feeling so dislocated and uncertain, and that would bring out the worst in us, like again, sort of what we think about with Neanderthals, or we used to think about.
Mad Max stuff.
Yeah. But really what you find is that this is a really key time, and when people first start working together in a new way. So there's one of the very, very earliest monuments in Peru is built from the mud of El Nino, like this mud that comes down from the mountains in these flash floods. And there's this, incredible, super arid desert environment. I mean, it looks like Mars or something, but it's all white. And today the sea is a little farther away, but people really like to live near rivers at that time for obvious reasons. It was hard to get water, and so this was a little farther away from a river, not that great to live. People probably would have visited, camped overnight, maybe hunted some birds. But once the El Nino mud starts flowing down, this becomes an incredibly lush coastal wetland, fish, streams, swamps, birds, and the people come too, and they build for the first time. They really work together and start building a pyramid out of the mud of El Nino.
Why would they do that?
it's a great question. I think we don't really know. Of course, we'll never really know. But for me, when I was thinking about, okay, what is a disaster like? What are the disasters that I've experienced like, and what gets reported over and over again for people experiencing disaster today, hunter-gatherers experience disaster. Like, you know, even though our instinct and from the stories and the movies that we watch is that, yeah, it's going to be Mad Max, I think, you know, the experiences that we have, and I know I've had, is really so much more about communities coming together, and like people want to be together, they want to recover together after these events, and there's, you know, there's, you know, no one is a stranger after you've all
Right.
been through.
So in the
a
face of this
disruption.
disaster, they have, and this apocalypse, they have then transitioned to a new kind of society.
Yeah.
That includes monument building, which is a fascinating aspect of it that you can't really put a finger on why.
Yeah, and it's, you know, there's a lot of debate of whether, you know, do you need a ruler to kind of be directing building a monument? I think archaeologists used to think you definitely needed someone to be in charge and be like, these people go here and those people go there. And I think a lot of archaeologists today are much more willing to see kind of collective action as driving these events. But for me, it was, you know, it really, instead of making new ideas and new kinds of communities and new levels of cooperation, instead of making those things impossible, it was the apocalypse that actually, like, or very, you know, very possibly gave people the motivation and the actual raw material to start thinking in a new way. And I think that, you know, for me, I found it really fruitful to sort of imagine that monument, like what was, maybe that was, you know, maybe it was a monument to El Nino, maybe it was a monument to the communities that were forming, maybe this was the place, you know, because the environment had changed so much, maybe this was a place where people came after the disasters to kind of regroup and figure out what was next, because, you know,
But it would have come out of their communal aspect of this new feeling of a community that they would have needed a monumental place to go to.
I think so, or I think it's worth, you know, for for a lot of the book, like with the Neanderthals, going back and thinking about, you know, what's the real evidence for this conventional wisdom that we've all learned, and sort of over and over again seeing that there was really not very much evidence. And for me, I sort of said, okay, what is there as much evidence for this new and more interesting idea that I'd like to develop than there is for these old, boring, you know, racist ideas that we really need to be rid of? And I think, you know, in a lot of cases, like, you know, I think in many places in the book, it is, the point is not to replace one, you know, totalitizing narrative with another and say, like, this is definitely what happened in the past and this is definitely how we should think about it, but just kind of open space for what are the other possibilities here that are supported by the science and supported by what we know about ourselves and what we know about who we can be in these situations, and not just the worst.
It's never as black and white as we think.
Yes.
But even in your treatment of that refuting that black and white thing, you use that as a way of getting new information. You feed that into us. It's a really interesting thing. So our first example of the human extinction is non-extinction. That's more of an intellectual treatment of this idea. This one is more, well, what happens to people in the face of a disaster? It might not be as disastrous as we think in the long run. It's bad while it goes on.
Yeah.
Let's not kid ourselves around. It's horrible. But then there's new solutions to the problem that lead to a higher elevated thing, literally in this case. I have to tell you, I did a show down in Peru. Forgive me while I take the stage for 2 minutes here. Give this poor woman a rest. This is actually enhances your story because it's pre-Inca, around 1300s, I'd say, Chimu society in Peru. They found in 2024 the largest child sacrifice burial in the world, in history, 200 plus, incredibly careful, ritualistically buried kids all around, and also a lot of llamas.
Baby llamas.
Baby llamas, exactly. Couldn't be more graphic. It's like, oh my God. And it was found in the most amazing thing, and this is actually a segue to talking about archaeology. So the archaeologist who was contacted about this find was called by a pizzeria owner in this beachside community, a surfing community. and that he ignored it. His kids were bringing home pieces of bone. His dog came home with a skull one day. And he's like, there's something going on in the empty lot across the way. And he calls the local landmark place, the Chimo, these fabulous ruins that are nearby. And the guy's like, I got too much to do. I don't want to go over this pizzeria guy thing. And he ignores it 3 times, he told me. I interviewed this guy 3 times. And finally, the 3rd time, he goes, okay, fine. And he goes over to this vacant lot, which had been under construction, which is so often the case, you know, just like the Neanderthal discovery. And he looks around and he sees bones everywhere. And they're small bones. And he's like, what's going on here? Suffice to say, this is the beginning of the discovery of his lifetime, this man, this archaeologist, who then becomes world famous through this pizzeria discovery excavation site. And it becomes a whole storytelling that he has to explain. And he explains to me that in the face of El Nino, in the face of disastrous weather that's just coming in like the Pineapple Express on that coastline, the political leadership has to come up with something to satisfy the people that they're doing this, that they're doing something about it. Sacrifice is the go-to thing, of course. So in the face of the worst disaster that they say that has no end in sight, they decide to do the most extreme kind of sacrifice they can do. So they get the youngest child from every village in the area sent to this place. We're gonna do it like we really mean it. And every village wants a better life, so they send their little kid, you know, down there. And they literally line these kids up, and I won't go into the details, but it's bad. And one by one, these children are sacrificed, showing this political leadership really means business to the gods. Did they believe it? Probably not. That's as cynical as it gets. They probably knew that this wasn't really going to do anything, but it would at least keep the people, the masses
Yeah,
safe.
and I think that's a great example, you know, the difference of like burying your, 200 sacrificed children in the mud of the El Nino flood versus using the flood to build a pyramid. You know, one of the things that I saw over and over again in the book is the apocalypse. Apocalypse is like El Nino, repeated, natural disasters like El Nino. They really collide with the societies that exist, and they exploit the weak points of the societies as they exist at that time. And so, if you have a really hierarchical, stratified, socioeconomically and politically stratified society like the Chimu, which was extremely complex, extremely, there were, extremely complicated political leadership, people with commoners, elites, you get an apocalypse like El Nino, and they, the people in power are able to take advantage of that in some way to say like, okay, well, we're going to react, we have to do something to preserve our power and our standing, and so maybe, that in that case it's sacrificing all these children. And so, I think apocalypse is really, it's not just the climate change, it's not just the repeated natural disasters, it's not just the plague, it's the societies as they exist before the apocalypse hits that really provide the rungs of inequality that sort of direct the worst violence of the apocalypse in certain directions. I think we all saw that with COVID-19. It definitely happened in the Black Death. And, I think before you have those kind of stratified hierarchical societies that we all live in today and we think are kind of like the pinnacle of human development, there were a lot more possibilities of just how to be organized, what kinds of jobs to do, how to relate to each other, and how to react in the face of an apocalypse. And I think, it's really interesting that once a society, we are so terrified to lose complex societies, like that in and of itself would be an apocalypse, but it's that, I think I saw over and over that the complex society will not protect you in the face of these events, and often, and often it makes these events so much worse to experience, especially if you're, especially depending on who you are within that society.
I mean, many of these stories have reference points for us today in a big way. I mean, they all resonate. I want to point out the fact that this all happens on a worldwide basis. All these chapters are all over the map, quite literally. There's 14 of them listed. There are more in the book. But all of these are the different locations of these stories that happen from Australia all the way to North America to everything. But you live in Mexico City. Well, you know what,
Yes.
before this, there's a young man out here I want to talk about one thing for, and that this is a love letter to archaeology,
Oh,
isn't it?
yes. Yes, absolutely.
In a surprising way, even though
Yeah.
you've written about archaeology, obviously, this was a new level for you.
Yeah, and it, part of what gave me the idea of the book was that all these archaeologists, we all, the archaeologists love stories of societal collapse too, and it's a big part of the history of the field and what people study. But the stories they were finding were just not the stories that they just ran counter to all the conventional wisdom I thought I knew, and somehow these much more complex and hopeful and creative and stories that were full of opportunities just like weren't reaching the general public. And I think what's so special to me about archaeology is that I think I write in the introduction, like no kind of person is invisible to archaeology. Like not everything gets preserved. There's obviously, huge, that's a huge issue that archaeologists have to deal with, thinking about what lasts for thousands of years and what doesn't. But, on principle, if you're writing a document throughout history, even today, you're a certain kind of person with a certain kind of position in a society, a certain kind of education, a certain kind of privilege, and you're going to have a certain perspective. And so the details of a historical document can be, tremendously evocative and fascinating and rich, but they can also be really biased and sort of trap you in thinking that everybody in a society had the same experience. And what's so wonderful to me about archaeology and what archaeologists are doing more and more is really they're interested in everyone in a society, and especially the people who wouldn't have had so much of a
Well,
voice.
the business has changed. I mean, it used to
Yes.
be Indiana Jones. It used to be
Yeah.
opening up tombs and getting artifacts and taking them home to your country
Yes.
and basically stealing them. That was the old form of archaeology.
Yes.
It has now changed, helped along by DNA, I mean, by technology, but also by political change and cultural change. And archaeology has gone with it. I mean, I can't tell you how many cool conversations I've had in the dark, with these really interesting people, men and women who are just like really passionate about understanding these people, rebuilding in their minds these whole societies. And it's so concrete, like here's a wall. I can see how this wall went. Like there's a physical aspect to the work,
Yeah.
but then there's this intellectual aspect of projecting it larger. There's just no cooler field in the world, Hayden.
No, and writing about it, it's like writing science fiction or fantasy. Like that's what's so fun about
Yes.
it. There's so many amazing details, so many ways of thinking that I never thought about just from the archaeologists themselves, and trying to understand what it really felt like to inhabit a culture that believes things that never occurred to me, that related to people related to each other in a way that I never considered before. The religions are completely different and sometimes somewhat incomprehensible these days or unknowable. But just the idea that I think one of the dangers of the way that we live today is we've come to think of history as this kind of march of inevitable progress, and now we've like reached the pinnacle of how societies are supposed to be. And surprise apocalypse comes, and like we only have the only place we have to go is down. And I think when you start to get a sense of how many different ways there are to organize society, how many different ways there are to be human, and how many different ways there have been to survive in the past, like that, that sense of like that there's only one path that we're all on, and the instant we fall off of it, it's like it's an apocalypse. It's the end of the world. I think that's what archaeology is a gift it's really given me, to see like how just try to expand my own mind beyond the assumptions that I've been taught and living with for my whole life. And
Well, you were an American who now
I
lives in
know.
Mexico.
Yeah, well,
so-
yeah, that's a good transition.
It's really, I mean, you've challenged yourself to look at things differently just by your personal life and your work. You were a Latin American correspondent for Science magazine,
Yes.
among other things. But that has forced a perspective change for you, which is very much in keeping with the theme of the book. So let's talk about Mexico as like ground zero for so much of this thinking. We'll focus on the Mexica,
Yeah.
which many people think of as the Aztecs. Okay, so we're in what is now Mexico City. Help me with pronunciation. Tenochtitlan.
Tenochtitlan.
There you go, Tenochtitlan.
Yeah.
Which is Mexico City. And I'll blurt this out. Mexico City used to look nothing like it looks today. It was filled with, it had all kinds of lakes, Lakes Texcoco, right?
Texcoco.
Texcoco.
Yeah. Texcoco.
Which would be where they got Texaco from, wasn't it?
I guess.
Mexican oil. They must have gotten so many revelations.
That one never occurred to me.
Yeah, and this migrating band has come down, and they plan here. We don't want to go through the whole of the culture, but we do want to get to the point that the Spanish come. And what happens as the apocalypse takes hold there?
Yeah, so I think one of the apocalypses in the book is the apocalypse of European colonialism, which is, the foundation that, if apocalypses create new worlds, that apocalypse has created our world. And it really hasn't ended, and we're still in it. And I think one of the things I wanted to do with all the apocalypses in the book is really explore the kind of lost sense of human agency, of decision making, of what it felt like to live like moment by moment through these events where you didn't know the end of the story, where things weren't inevitable because they never were. And I think colonialism is one of our understanding of it has been so colored by the sense that this was just the way it had to be. It was just, the destruction of indigenous societies, the imposition of European ones was just kind of an inevitable outcome of the epidemics and the superior technology. This absolutely insane idea that indigenous people would have reacted to European people as if they were gods. I mean, that there's absolutely no evidence of that. Surprise, surprise. And I really wanted to both explore the ongoing, truly catastrophic impacts of European colonialism, but also bring in the stories of the people who experienced it and experienced especially the beginnings of these stories when they were really acting, in ways that have been lost to us, or like we're not really taught. I mean, it's not that hard to find the stories, which is why it's so crazy that they are insisted on not being told. But so I tell the story of the conquest of Mexico City, which really should be called like the Spanish. Well, it really should be called the Mexica Tlaxcalteca War, with the Tlaxcalteca War is kind of the arch enemies of the Aztec or the Mexica.
Well, let me interrupt for 1 second.
Yes,
The
please.
common mythology is that 50 conquistadors
Yes.
came over. This is after Columbus. Now the conquistadors are coming over wanting that gold, and somehow 50 of them, led by Cortez, take over this Aztec empire. That's the common mythology, which of course, it takes 2 seconds to realize that could never happen. But most people don't have the time in their day to think beyond that.
No.
The beauty of your book and the beauty of your explanation is I learned everything I need to learn to change that mentality completely, based on all the political machinations that were happening in the area. By the way, very similar to what happened in North America with indigenous tribes up here. Many, many political ties that were utilized, divide and conquer, all that stuff happens right in this area, right?
Yeah, so it's, I think we have this sense, because of this kind of myth of inevitability, that the, indigenous people were living in some kind of like eternal past, and like they had like the Stone Age technology and their societies hadn't changed or evolved as much as European societies had, and that was part of what made the destruction inevitable. But of course, the indigenous societies were just as modern, just as complex, just as advanced, quote unquote. I hate these like all societies are just what they are. They're not better or worse than any others. But this sense that they're like the Spanish in Mexico in particular really walked into a really, really complex political landscape that they never really understood. And like even at the very end of that story, they still didn't quite understand what they had gotten into. And so, the Mexica were the leaders of the Triple Alliance, which today we call the Aztec Empire. And they lived in Tenochtitlan, which is Mexico City, and they had their arch enemies of the Tlaxcalteca that were more or less democratic republic, kind of resistors to empire, just like 100 miles away, if that, really close. And they'd been, fending off Mexica domination for centuries. And so when the Spanish arrived with, new technologies, yes, but like more importantly, new philosophies of war and attitudes towards violence, and they were just much more willing. Violence in Mesoamerica was extremely ritualized. Like there was a planting season, there was a war season, and like you would never, as civilians were never attacked. Like it was very, you'd meet in the battlefields. It was all kind of planned in advance.
Even the killing on the battlefields
Yeah,
wasn't
they
nearly
didn't really kill each other in the battlefields. The goal was to take captives and then have, sacrifice ceremonies later, which could be years later. I mean, and so it was really, and Europeans come in, and the idea is to do whatever you can to take over the territory.
Right, and
through
slaughter
violence.
in the
Yeah.
open, and oh my God.
Yeah, slaughter as quickly as you can, as many people as you can, whether, surprise attack at night. They had horses, which were, on open ground, could be really,
Yeah.
really terrifying.
There's all those
and speed up the slaughter.
Neanderthals coming up.
Exactly. And, so so it's not quite that the Spanish were, it wasn't the technology, it wasn't even really the diseases. It was like the way that the attitude toward violence, and also the way that attitude toward violence was taken advantage of by people to change their political situation. And so, the Tlaxcalteca allied with the Spanish, and they took down the Aztec Empire, and that sort of opened the door to the country of Mexico today. And that also, this is what really got me thinking about apocalypses, not only as violence and destruction, but also new beginnings and transformations, because, the place that I live was literally created from this wound. And, and people, I think when you live in a place like Mexico City, where all of, like, the history is so close to the surface, and the effects of it are still so visible in our everyday experiences, like it just, I've been struggling a little bit with describing the book as like, well, is it optimistic or pessimistic? Is it hopeful or not hopeful? And like, I've actually come to think that like the fact that we think of those things as binaries is part of the problem. Like they're not really binaries. Like, yes, the conquest of Mexico was extremely violent and destructive and absolutely horrible to live through, and it created a whole new culture, a whole new country, a whole new city, and it's a city that I really love, and I think and a culture that is so vibrant and interesting, and that I've chosen to make my life in. And so I think
no
that
mosquitoes.
Yeah, no mosquitoes. It is high up, and I think that sense of destruction and creation in one, and also the lingering effects of the destruction, and how we're still trying to cope with it every day, and still reinventing ourselves, and still building a new city every time there is a disaster. And
Sure.
All of that really made me think about this.
That's the chapter you get personal with. This
Yeah.
is a first-person kind of discussion of what it's like to live in Mexico City as a modern person. But you're really turning a lens on this modern version of the city that still shows all the layers that are directly resulting from apocalypse.
Yes.
The death of that former culture, the transformation, I should say, of that former culture into this new colonialized culture that then has to work it out for probably thousands of years yet to come, or however long it's going to take to wash that out. This is the recurrent problem from chapter to chapter, is that it's really hard to have perspective over something that takes that long.
Yes.
But you've given us this tool, this book, to get in there and find out that there's these factoids. Where do you get the information? What's your day of work?
Great question. A lot of it's based on interviews, and I think part of the sad part for me of the book is that so much of it was written during quarantine and lockdown that I couldn't really go to many of the places I was exploring in interviews and papers and in my own imagination. But usually what I'll do is usually start by interviewing the scientists. And everyone is like, oh, it must be so boring and weird to have to talk to scientists all the time. And I just think it's the best job in the world. They're the best people to interview. They are so enthusiastic. You're always getting to talk to people about like their number one passion and life's work, which is it's just such a delight. And so I really, and they have all these papers, they publish journal papers with lists of references that you can go through and find out the history of the idea and who's working on the next things, and all of that is just so wonderful. So I think a lot of the book was based on interviews, remote interviews. There's a little bit of field work in it that I was lucky to get to do. And then, when we have it, historical documents, especially as we move towards, the Neanderthals didn't really leave historical documents, but there's a lot of historical documents about Mexico and the colonial world.
Yeah,
so.
the Archaeological Museum alone, worth the
Yes.
price. How are we doing for time? Yeah? Okay, good. Boy, I could go on forever and ever. I'm so serious. What? Have I proven that? Yeah, we need to, we're going to open this up to a Q&A.
Yes.
But it takes a moment to change the camera, right? So give us a moment. I'll vamp.
That's why you're here.
That's why I'm here, the one thing I'm here for. I do want to ask you one more thing, and this will be while we do this. How does all this press down on our present situation, for you? Does this get, do you explore this in the book, or do you think personally about this? What's the apocalypse we're in, and how does all this help you understand it?
Yes, although I'd rather answer it when we had the live stream going.
All right.
So please let me know.
Say again?
Okay, great. Oh, the audio is continuing. Oh, fantastic. Yeah, I think that's a really important part of the book, and part of why I wanted to write it. And I think part of what I learned writing the book is that, I think we're scared of change, and we're scared of radical change, and I don't think that makes us particularly unusual in human history. I think that's a natural thing to feel. But what I saw over and over again in the book was not the people who were most successful at surviving and adapting and transforming in the face of apocalypse were not the ones who tried to stop the apocalypse. They were the ones who were willing to accept the apocalypse and to kind of harness the energy of it, and to say, like, what is this revealing about the society that we live in now that isn't working for us anymore? Like, what new world has this created, and how do we need to meet that moment? And I think that's the biggest lesson for me, for sure, carrying through today. Like, not, thinking about radical acceptance and a willingness to use that energy to really change in ways that we need to.
But if you were, in another world, another time, writing thousands of years beyond this, looking back, how would you categorize our apocalypse?
Oh, I think that's such a great question. I think about it all the time, and I think it's actually, I came to think that the apocalypse that I felt was most similar to ours was the classic Maya collapse, which took about 300 years to really play out over the course of the whole thing, in the sense that it was a very interconnected world, and so something would go wrong in this one place in the South, and then there was, I think, a very recognizable refugee crisis leading to political revolution in the midst of a mega drought, and it's like, that sounds familiar. and the thing that happened for the classic Maya is that they, and because of the history of archaeology, because of the colonial history of archaeology, we think of the classic Monic and, in some sense, beautiful and haunting images of the end of a civilization. But what really is going on is the rejection of a political system and a social hierarchy based around divine kingship. And I think, and when the apocalypse is over, the Maya never go back to having kings. They have cooperative governments. They still have cities. They still have trade. They still have big places, big communities, but they don't have the same kinds of all-powerful leaders that they did before, and it's much more cooperative, much more collaborative. I mean, some of them look a little more like oligarchy than democracy, you know, but it's not looking like a divine king. And I just think if that happened anywhere else in the world, we would be being inspired by this story of political revolution from the ground up.
So in the face of our apocalypse, we'll get a functioning Congress.
Well, maybe. You know, I do think apocalypses are not only do they force societies to change, they're the best chances societies ever have for change.
Yeah.
So,
I mean,
you know.
the title of that particular chapter on the Maya is How Post-Apocalyptic Societies Reinvent Themselves, which is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
In the face of all of it. The difference, though, to me, is that we're in a global apocalypse.
Yes.
That's different than regional apocalypses, right?
Somewhat. I think, you know, I think colonialism's a global apocalypse. I think sea level rise was a global apocalypse. And I think that people felt more, you know, I think people were always more interconnected than we feel. But, you know, it is important to think about, you know, one of the great strategies for coping with apocalypse is leaving, you know, like getting out, going somewhere else, starting over somewhere new. And I think, you know, the political situation, not just in the US today, is making that harder and harder and harder for people to do. And because I think the people making it hard for others to move think that they're never going to be the ones who have to move themselves. And I think that sooner or later, they're going to find out that they're wrong about that.
But the other aspect of it, and the big message of this, is they're survivors. That's I mean, of course there were, but you say that's a significant factor in all of these stories.
Yes.
That it's a myth that things end, and then, you know, it's the survivors who carry on.
Yes.
All right.
Q&A, yes.
Q&A.
Let's have questions.
Who would like to be first?
I think we have to pass around one of the microphones.
Oh, okay.
So we can. Oh, we have great.
Hands, please. Yes, sir.
You said that because you did a lot of the interviews remotely, that you weren't able to travel to some. Is there a place that you would like to travel to see things in person?
Do I need to repeat the question or not?
No, you're good.
Okay.
Oh, let me
What did you
think
miss in
about
this
that.
book for the sequel?
Yeah. No, I think I would have really loved to go to Peru. Like, Peru is such a great, I mean, it's an amazing country. The landscapes are amazing, and the archaeological preservation improved partially because it's so dry, at least in the places that I discuss, like the Andes and the coast. Just, you know, I've been there not for this research, but just the level of, I mean, they have fabric, they have clothes, I mean, colors, like it's just
Remember
so
I sent you
beautiful.
that knit shop?
Yeah. And I think I would have, I think I really would have loved to go to Peru. And I'd also love to go to Egypt. I think that would be really fun to see the, you know, not just the iconic shot of the pyramids, but all the people working underneath them and figuring things out and discovering, you know, I'd love to kind of get a sense of what real on-the-ground archaeology looks like in Egypt today, because I think it's really different than what even I have in my head.
Next question, yes.
A lot of the scenarios that played out, you mentioned, were in smaller regions, like a country or a single continent, but of course, the apocalypse you're alluding to is going on currently is global. What's the largest historical parallel that you might draw from what you're looking at?
I think it's probably the sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, which I think is it's been a really hard apocalypse to understand, partially because, I mean, the places are literally underwater and they're very hard to find and excavate, although, as you'll read in my book, the archaeologists are working on that.
This is chapter 2.
Chapter 2.
Doggerland?
Yes, Doggerland.
Yeah.
And really all the coasts around the world, and sort of thinking about how, and that also went on for almost 2,000 years. So, like, you know, I think this speed of sea level rise and the cultural reactions that the archaeologists are able to see, it was obvious people knew something was happening, and we're adapting to it kind of in real time and moving around or building new ways to try to stay in their homes for as long as they could. So people, you know, but thinking about how, you know, that's even, you know, for me, it's like, the classic Maya 300 years, that's so long, but thinking even about that one, which was 2,000 years, and kind of that level of constant change becoming the world that you, in some sense, expect to live in or believe that you have always lived in and your children will always live in and your descendants will always live in. I think that's something I think about a lot. If like we're at quite, I think it's fair to say we're at the beginning of something, and I wonder in, 300 years or even a couple thousand years, like how whether change might not be so scary anymore because it is just the fabric
Right.
of life, and that is what it means to live in an environment, is to cope with how it's changing. And I think that is something that the people of that time period were able to do, and that we have a lot to learn.
How
We
to put
could really
cinder
value
blocks together,
to learn from them.
build our bunkers. Next question.
Yes. Is there a topic or an event that you didn't get to explore from this book that you've piqued your interest and now you want to get into it?
Yeah, I'd love to, there was a whole thing that I couldn't really bring together about how apocalypse led to the rise of agriculture, which I think is really interesting, like climate change and something that we think of as a net positive for human societies, really came out of adaptations to, it happened differently in different parts of the world, but adaptations to climate change. What else? There's so many great stories throughout time. I wish that I'd been able to talk about God, maybe not.
Maybe you covered everything.
Maybe I did. I just am so in love with these stories. I'm trying to remember what I thought.
Human apocalypses. I mean, the dinosaurs have their
Well,
apocalypse.
yeah, they have those. But I think it's. I think that's a wonderful question. Oh, here's one. I wish I could have explored more about Angkor Wat, and I think there's actually a great book called Four Lost Cities by Annalee Newitz, who is another archaeology writer, and they actually get into a lot of the examples that I didn't, either because they didn't quite fit, like Pompeii, and Angkor Wat. Oh, and a great one that I didn't get into that is in Four Lost Cities is Cahokia, which is a city it's kind of near St. Louis, a medieval period, around year 1000, 1100. We have this myth in North America that indigenous cultures of North America didn't build cities, but in fact they did, and this is the biggest one. And people seem to have, it similarly to some stories in my book, it seems to collapse during a period of climate change, and it seems to be completely rejected, the social hierarchy, the sense of economic stratification. People are just that really didn't work for us and we're never doing it again. And they didn't. And I think that story that archaeologists and indigenous people are working together to tell about, how people, we have this sense that whatever happens to us in response to especially climate change, we're not really in control of, or we don't have a choice. And I think Cahokia is a great example of you do have a choice, and you do, if the society that you've built isn't working anymore, you don't have to stick with it. You can really change, and people did. And I think that's a wonderful story that I didn't get to explore.
The necessity of change. Yes. Anyone?
Do you have any examples? Because I'm freaked out about AI in terms of how that, and were there examples of how new technology is also responsible for an apocalypse, some change that happened that dislocated the society to such a degree?
No, I think there's some, I had some assumptions about that, especially with the colonialism story, because that's such a big piece of how we've learned to think about it, that the superior technology came in and it was impossible to compete with. And in fact, that really wasn't true at all. The indigenous societies adapted very quickly to European technology. They don't write about being things that would have exploded or horses would have been like, I imagine quite scary at first, but not, once you're like a couple years into this, like they would have known what was going on and how to defend against it. Actually, the European Spaniard fighters like often adopted, many of them didn't have like, they were kind of nobodies, like poor nobodies in Spain. Like that's why they ended up coming to Mexico, and they didn't have these suits of armors or amazing steel swords, and so they adopted a lot of the indigenous fighting tactics and weaponry and obsidian. And so I think, and in part of one of my favorite chapters is in ancient Egypt, and this kind of explosion of once a very hierarchical, unified, very controlling state collapses, in this kind of intertwined political crisis and period of climate change, there's just like an explosion and really like liberation in the technology that people were using. So the potter's wheel was like relatively new technology in ancient Egypt when this collapse happened. But before the collapse, people were really only making one shape of, ceramic pot, and it was kind of like standardized throughout the country. And it was this, the taste of the king. And after the collapse, the ways that people are using this technology like explode in creativity. Oftentimes these new kinds of pots are like really ugly and kind of badly made, but like they are all in different shapes. People are really trying new things, harnessing this new technology in new ways that they either weren't allowed to before or just didn't think to before. And so I think, it's not really, for me, it's less about the technologies coming in and causing a big disruption, which is something that I didn't see, but how people are, reinventing their technologies to meet these new moments. And I think that that's really interesting too, to think about how we might think about our own agency over our own technologies. I think, again, like with climate change, we sort of think of our phones as like controlling our brains, and like I also feel that way, like it's not for no reason. But I think that I did not see a lot of technologies and new technologies causing apocalypses, but I saw apocalypses reshaping technologies and making new ones more valuable or viable, or even bringing old ones back into the spotlight that had been kind of abandoned before. And I think so. One thing that really happens in these kind of especially post-societal collapse moments is just a staggering amount of creativity, and often with the technological tools that they have already been working with, and they just new doors open up. People have different kinds of time, different kinds of motivations, and they really reinvent those technologies and reinvent how their place in their lives. And I think it's possible to maybe think about the technologies we have today, not causing the apocalypse, but how we can, again, kind of harness the apocalypse and change them to better serve our needs in
Or
the
land
future.
on Mars.
Yeah.
Yes.
I really like that you wrote about the aftermath of the classic Maya civilization, and just like that, you're imagining what it would be like to live in the ruins. And it was really nice, interesting just to think of it not as these things as lost cities, but as something that
Transitioning.
Yeah, transitioning. I wonder, is there, and just because it's my culture still like really rich and just completely different, was there reading that you did that really helped you to understand that? Or like, what is, I don't know, I guess what is the writing sort of about that evolution of that culture, and how much is that documented, and were there original documents?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So there's so much Maya history written down from the classic period, and like what survives is carved into stone. And so, it was only in the 90s that the classic Maya language was fully deciphered, and that's because it's related to some Maya languages today, not all of them, but some of them. And so there's like a tremendous amount of history of the classic period, but kind of the reason that archaeologists like had this idea that the Maya had disappeared, which obviously is like there's millions of Maya people today, and they were in fact taking these archaeologists to the ruins and showing them. So like the archaeologists knew that this wasn't true, but but the dates carved into the stone kind of stop, like this one way of recording history stops. And that's really because, those were, if you're carving history and dynasties into stone, you're doing it kind of at the behest of these kings, and they're falling and they're fleeing and they're finding their ways to new cities. And so there's not very much recordings that archaeologists have access to of the collapse itself. It's more like they can sort of see its reflection and when and where cities were. I mean, as you say, like the idea that these cities were abandoned is complicated and in fact not true in a lot of cases. But the political, their previous political structure ceased, and you can kind of see that in the way that people stopped recording history. And in fact, what people were mostly doing, and during the classic period, and certainly after, when again like these technologies were used in new ways, and people were like, well, I don't need to like spend a bunch of time carving like dozens of stones into like perfect huge blocks to fit into a staircase because the king wants me to. And the cities they built were kind of much more efficient building technologies, and they would kind of finish it with stucco and paint it, and like that was going to be like they didn't need to spend a lot of time carving the stone because they had these beautiful murals. And you go to them today and they just kind of, they don't look as impressive as the classic cities where the stones themselves were kind of the impressive, beautiful things. But it's not that they weren't impressive and beautiful in and of themselves. Those things have just decayed, and so we can't see them anymore. And people were really spending time on other things. And one of the technologies that the Maya always had were books. And so I think that it's very, very likely that a lot of the collapse history could have been recorded in books. And there are books talking about Mayapan, which is the kind of post-collapse capital that arises where the government's more cooperative. It's a confederacy instead of a monarchy. And so some of those books do survive, but the vast majority of them were purposely burned by the Spanish colonizers and in the very early colonial era. Sometimes the very same priests who they were kind of trying to coerce Maya people to like write down their alphabet, which is not, it's not an alphabet. And they were kind of forcing it into European forms and then burning all the primary sources. So I think it's quite possible that a lot more of that history was recorded in like a way that we would think like in written history, and it was just like really tragically and unjustly destroyed in the next apocalyptic moment.
Anyone else?
I was wondering if you looked at, like ancestry tests when you get your mitochondrial DNA, and if that's like how apocalypse affects that, whether localized or migratory, like 10,000 years ago, and it changes. Yeah.
That's really interesting. I didn't really look at that. The only real ancient DNA stuff in the book is the Neanderthals and Denisovans, but I think like that, those patterns that, especially mitochondrial DNA, because it's so, those can give you like big population histories because they're shared in maternal lineages, and then if you have a whole genome, you can really like drill down into individual people's lives. But yeah, I didn't really look at that, but I think it would be really interesting to do so and sort of think about how, I think part of what I tried to do in the book is think about how like all of our societies today are the descendants of these other ones, and like how many things had to happen for us to be here right now, and both in terms like kind of biologically and culturally, and also in that trying to feel like we are all one of the things I tried to do in the book is really like when thinking about an ancestor like really deep in the past, try to imagine them as having just as much creativity and imagination and emotions and being surprised and being scared, and being resourceful. You know, I tried to really, you know, I think in archaeology, because you kind of, the scientists kind of necessarily work on the span of decades or centuries a lot of the time, you know, that kind of sense that people have always been people gets kind of lost. And I did try to use some of the more creative writing in the book to imagine individual lives and really make them very rich in a way that archaeology doesn't always
It
allow.
actually makes me feel, reading these, how recent everything is.
Yeah.
I mean, human
Oh, yeah.
civilization is, you know, 10,000 years old. You
Yeah,
it's-
I know,
it's-
I totally agree. It's crazy how.
in the context of billions of years. Anyone else? One more. We'll do one more. Yeah.
Right now, a lot of us are, especially in the U.S. scientific community, are going through sort of a micro-apocalypse of our funding streams and life as we had known it. Do you have any, I really like how you talked about harnessing the energy and in a positive way and thinking about change of new things. Do you have any guidance on how we can stay optimistic as we see our labs move with this?
Preach.
I mean, I'm so sorry that you're experiencing that. It's you know, a true tragedy and so unfair and really shouldn't be happening at all. And, you know, that's one apocalypse I hope gets reversed like instantly. I think we still have a chance. But I will say that I think let me think about this. So I think one thing that in the I'll say the U.S., but I don't think it's exclusive to the U.S. Culture is really bad at doing is taking time to grieve and really process what we're going through and what we're facing. And I think I think a lot of us felt both that kind of like antsiness around COVID, that we didn't quite know what these feelings we were having were, where to put them, or just the feeling of having to sit with them in our houses. I mean, it literally drove half of us crazy. Like, I think that's a big part of what the problem that we're facing now. And so I think, you know, obviously harnessing the energy of an apocalypse is a great thought, and one that I think is really important and necessary and is the way forward in the future. But I also think that the cultures that we have, that we come from in this room, have really trained us like not to process and sit with and really feel the effects of what's happening. And I think that that's a really important first step to figuring out, okay, like what world am I even in now? I don't think, and what world am I in, and how do I need to change to meet it, or what is it asking of me? But I don't really think you can even get to the question of what world am I in now if we don't sort of slow down and take the time to understand what we're losing.
It's really using the idea of apocalypse as a kickoff to evolution, isn't it? It's the first step in that process.
Yes.
Do you feel heard? Have we said everything we need to say tonight?
I think this is beautiful, yes, and I'm happy to answer any more questions personally, and we have snacks, and I'll be signing books. So thank you so much for coming, and thank you again to Automata for having us.
Oh, yeah.